After 3 days of rain, the Bell field no longer looked like farmland. Shallow brown water stretched from the county road to the tree line, broken only by fence posts, patches of grass, and the rusted arm of an excavator beside an unfinished drainage ditch. Ruth Bell stood on the shoulder with Aaron Landry, watching water slide across ground that had swallowed machinery before. A pickup slowed beside them. The driver had rented the field years earlier. He lowered his window and studied the flooded rows. It's 42 acres of water with dirt underneath. There was no humor in his voice. He had lost 2 soybean crops there, along with a tractor axle that snapped while being pulled from the mud. By his figures, pumping the field dry cost more than the crop was likely to bring. Aaron listened without arguing. Then he rolled his pants above his knees, lifted a bundle of red survey stakes from his truck, and stepped into the water. He drove the first stake near the roadside, another farther out, then continued across the field. Ruth assumed he was marking a straighter route to the drainage gate, but the line did not point toward the outlet. It crossed the direction of the moving water. Aaron had spent 20 years helping farmers remove water from fields. Now he was marking the places where he intended to slow it down. 7 months earlier, the field had been dry enough to walk, though the old watermarks still showed on the fence posts. Ruth Bell had tried to lease it 3 times in 5 years. Long ago, the land had carried rice. After the levees weakened and the water control structures fell into disrepair, later tenants switched to soybeans, hoping for a simpler crop with lower pumping costs. The field never cooperated for long. Planting ran late. Tractors sank where the soil looked firm. Spring rain left broad sections too wet to harvest, while weeds kept growing whether the crop made money or not. Ruth did not call the place worthless out of spite. The numbers had worn her down. Property taxes still came due. Grass had to be cut. Levees needed repair, and every attempt to drain the lowest ground consumed more fuel. Aaron offered to lease all 42 acres for 1 season at a low cash rate. In return, he would repair the gate and levees, pay the pumping costs, keep water off neighboring land, and return the field ready for planting by the middle of May. Ruth added one final condition. If the ground was not usable by then, the agreement ended. Aaron signed. That evening, his 19-year-old daughter, June, read every line at the kitchen table. She unfolded the field map, circled the May deadline, and closed the contract. What happens if the water won't leave when you need it to? Aaron looked at the date she had marked. I'll have to know before then. Aaron Landry was 44 and had spent most of his working life installing irrigation lines, repairing pumps, and figuring out why water refused to go where a plan said it should. He could read a slope by the way rain settled along a tire track. A few inches of elevation told him where to place a pump, where a levee would leak, and which corner of a field would stay wet after the rest had dried. For years, that knowledge had paid steadily. Then the company cut crews, and Aaron lost the supervisor's job that had kept him close to home. He took small repair calls after that, driving from farm to farm with tools in the back of his truck, but he had no interest in spending the next decade working out of town for another contractor. June understood why the Bell field tempted him. She also remembered the used trencher he had bought for a drainage business that never found enough paying customers. 3 invoices went unpaid, and the machine was sold before the loan was. One evening, an advertisement for that same trencher appeared on her phone. June looked at the new owner's asking price, then cleared the screen without showing her father. Aaron was walking the Bell property, with a laser level and a worn elevation book. Seen from the road, the grassy ridges looked random. From ground level, they formed the remains of old rice levees. The water had never been directionless. It was still following a system most people had stopped recognizing. I'm not trying to beat this field, Aaron told June. I'm trying to find the work it already knows how to do. Aaron took the folded field map to Leanne Savoy, a local aquaculture specialist who had spent years advising growers on crawfish production. He spread the map across her desk and pointed to the old levees. How little would I have to change for this field to work? Leanne studied the elevation marks before answering. A rice crawfish system depended on timing. Crawfish needed a dry period to burrow and reproduce. The field needed enough forage or rice stubble to support the food web after flooding. Water had to return at the right season, remain shallow enough to manage, move through the full acreage, and still drain when the harvest ended. The plants help feed the system, she said, but once they're underwater, they start breaking down, flood too much at once, especially in warm weather, and that same forage can pull oxygen out of the water. She recommended that Aaron begin with 8 acres. June sat beside him with a calculator, entering the cost of repairing the gate, running the pump, and setting trap lanes. Even with a decent harvest, 8 acres would struggle to cover the fixed expenses. Aaron looked again at the 42 numbered sections. I'd still have to repair the same outlet and run the same pump. Leanne rested one hand on the map. Do you know 42 acres, or do you know one pump? Water is water, Aaron said. Leanne folded the map, then paused before handing it back. She circled 3 low sections in pencil and wrote beside them, "Watch these before dawn." Through spring and early summer, Aaron worked with what the field already had. He rebuilt the outer levee where rain had cut through it, repaired the old drainage gate, and filled several ditches that pulled water too quickly toward the outlet. The remaining rice levees were reshaped into low baffles meant to guide water across the field, instead of letting it choose one easy path. June divided the map into 42 sections, each close to an acre. She painted numbers on the survey stakes and kept a running account of diesel, pipe, seed, equipment hours, and every load of dirt Aaron moved. The total climbed faster than either of them liked. Rather than plant rice for grain, Aaron established enough growth to leave forage across the field. He bought healthy brood crawfish from a nearby producer and stocked them while the ground still held moisture. Once they settled in, he allowed the field to dry, giving them time to burrow before the seasonal flooding began. By midsummer, the surface looked ordinary again. Grass covered the rebuilt banks, and the crawfish had disappeared beneath soil that cracked under the heat. Ruth walked the levees one afternoon and studied the new crossbanks. Will those still be here when it's time to plant rice? Aaron pointed toward the repaired gate. Anything I can hold, I can release. June wrote the sentence along the edge of her cost map. She left it outside the columns reserved for confirmed figures. At the far corner, she drove in the final red stake. Number 42 stood on slightly higher ground, well beyond the easiest route for incoming water. Aaron checked the number before stepping away. That one counts too. By fall, the forage had filled in across most of the field, and a heavy rain system was moving toward the parish. Anyone who had watched that ground fail before expected Aaron to open the drainage gate and get ahead of the water. Instead, he shut it. Rain began before dark. Water gathered in the low sections, climbed over the rice stubble, and spread against the rebuilt levees. By morning, it had reached the first line of red stakes. Ruth drove out while the level was still rising. Is the pump down? Aaron checked the gate once more. It's doing exactly what I asked. The field from the opening now took shape around them. Water stretched toward the tree line, but this time it was being held inside repaired banks and redirected through the cross levees Aaron had built. He wanted every helpy the higher ground at the far end. To reach it quickly, he raised the water faster and deeper than Leanne had advised. June watched the marks disappear on the nearest stakes. Were you planning to flood all the forage at once? The shallow sections won't reach 42 unless I bring the rest up. That isn't what I asked. Aaron kept his eyes on the far corner. If half the field stays dry, they'll say the other half is still worthless. By late afternoon, the water had covered the last patch of exposed ground. Stake 42 stood alone for a few minutes, its red top reflected in the surface. Then the rising water crossed its lowest mark. The first traps went in near the water inlet and along a low levee where Aaron had seen fresh burrow openings. The next morning, most held only bait and muddy water. A few contained crawfish too small to sell. The second pull was better. By the end of the week, June had to brace one boot against the levee and lift with both hands. Several traps near the head of the field came up heavy. The crawfish were active, hard-shelled, and large enough to sort into market bags. Mace Guidry arrived in a white pickup with a hanging scale and 3 empty sacks. He bought live crawfish for restaurants and roadside seafood stands, but he made no promises to new growers. He emptied each bag onto a sorting table, pushed the undersized crawfish aside, and weighed what remained. This part I can use. The payment was modest, but it was the first money the Bell field had produced in years. Aaron laid the cash on the hood of his truck beside the latest fuel bill. For once, the amount coming in was larger than the cost of that morning's pump run. Ruth looked across the traps lined near the inlet. How much of the field did those come from? Aaron glanced at the full sacks. Enough to prove it works. June unfolded her map on the truck hood. Only 11 sections had been tested. She shaded them in and left the other 31 blank. Before she finished totaling the week's expenses, Aaron had already called a supplier and ordered more traps. Aaron and June moved the trap lines farther from the inlet until every numbered section had been tested. The pattern became harder to dismiss with each pull. Crawfish near the incoming water stayed marketable. A low strip through the center produced smaller animals, but enough to count. Behind several of Aaron's cross levees, the traps came back almost empty. The bait was still there, softened by the water, and barely touched. Section 42 produced nothing large enough to sell. They ran the routes again, then a third time. When June updated the map, more than a quarter of the field remained unshaded. Mace studied the records from the tailgate of his truck. "I can buy what you catch," he said. "I can't schedule customers around 11 good acres and a guess." Ruth had heard the same kind of optimism from earlier tenants. Each had found a patch that could produce something. The trouble was never one good corner. It was the ground that kept consuming money everywhere else. Aaron believed the crawfish simply had not spread evenly. He raised the water another few inches, extended the pump runs, and began shaping 2 additional baffles to push water toward the empty sections. He also asked what another load of brood crawfish would cost. June stopped writing. More crawfish won't explain this. She laid the map across the metal cover of the pump. The blank sections did not appear at random. They curved behind the newer levees, following nearly the same line as Aaron's red stakes. He studied the shape for a moment. The low ground has always held differently. Then why are the best traps beside moving water? Aaron folded the map before the wind could lift it. That night, the pump ran several hours longer than usual. A stretch of unseasonably warm weather settled over the field after the forage had been underwater for several weeks. The water still looked much the same, but it no longer smelled the same. June noticed the first drop in catch along the sections that had already been producing poorly. Then, before sunrise one morning, she found crawfish climbing onto the shallow edges and gathering near the fresh water entering the field. Aaron saw the weak traps and reached for the explanation that cost him the least pride. The field had never been stocked heavily enough. He called a producer to ask the price of another load of brood crawfish. June called Leanne before he placed the order. Leanne arrived while the sky was still dark. She tested the water near the inlet, then moved behind the newer cross levees. The incoming water still carried enough oxygen. Several sheltered sections did not. The deepest areas, where the flooded vegetation was breaking down fastest, gave the worst readings. Aaron watched her repeat the tests. The extra pump hours had moved more water into the field, but the new water had followed the easiest route toward the outlet. His baffles had protected pockets of older water from the circulation he thought he was creating. Leanne spread June's harvest map across the truck hood. Then she placed Aaron's levee plan over it. The empty sections followed the shape of his own construction. Aaron removed the laser level from its tripod and stared at the overlapping lines. The field had not failed to support crawfish. He had cut off the very acres he meant to bring into production. "How long have you known?" he asked. June kept one hand on the maps. "I knew where it was failing. I didn't know you'd listen." Aaron lowered the field several inches before sunrise. Once the pressure eased, he opened narrow cuts through the newer cross levees and marked 2 sections for removal. The work erased days of grading, diesel, and compacted soil. Some forage would be lost with the draining water, and the fuel already burned could not be recovered. Mace was expecting a shipment that morning. Aaron called from the tractor seat and canceled it. "I can hold the order until next week," Mace said, "but the price may not hold with it." "I understand." Aaron set the phone down and drove the tractor blade into the first baffle. Ruth arrived while he was cutting through the packed earth. Water slipped through the opening in a thin, muddy stream, carrying fragments of drowned vegetation into a section that had barely moved for weeks. She watched him widen the gap. "Does this mean the plan failed?" Aaron looked across the levee he had spent 3 days building. "That part did." Then he lowered the blade again. June had been standing beside the truck with the revised map. She took a bundle of numbered stakes from the bed, stepped into the water, and began measuring the new channel with him. Aaron pointed toward the sheltered sections behind the old baffle line. "I built those." June did not answer. She handed him the hammer he had given her earlier that summer. Together, they pulled the old red stakes from the soft ground and reset them along the new route. For several minutes, the only sounds were the tractor idling, the hammer striking wood, and water moving into a part of the field where it had stood still. Aaron did not rebuild the field from a single drawing. He and June worked section by section. They brought the water back shallow, then waited before raising it again. June recorded pump hours and trap weights while Aaron checked oxygen before daylight, when the readings were most likely to reveal trouble. If a cut-through improved one section but weakened another, they changed it. Some openings stayed wide. Others were narrowed with boards and packed soil. Aaron stopped raising the entire field just to reach one stubborn corner. The lower water reduced the amount they had to pump, but it also exposed differences the deeper flood had hidden. June changed the map. A shaded acre no longer meant only that crawfish had appeared there. She added the weight of each catch, the average size, and the date the section began producing. Several of the blank acres were not dead. They were late. One section began giving small crawfish almost 2 weeks after the traps near the inlet. Another produced fewer animals, but most were large enough to sell. The averages for the whole field had concealed both facts. 13 blank sections became 8. 8 became 5. Section 42 remained untouched. June colored the 37th producing acre and left the map open on the truck hood. Aaron studied the 5 empty spaces. Months earlier, he would have started the pump and raised the water until the highest one disappeared beneath it. Instead, he asked, "Which one tells us the most?" They returned to 42 with the laser level. A narrow ridge, only a few inches higher than the surrounding ground, was diverting the new flow around the section. The water reached the low area beyond it, but skipped the forage growing along the ridge itself. Aaron marked a short channel across the high strip. He did not deepen the whole field. By evening, a thin current crossed the ridge before dropping into the lower ground. On the nearby stakes, June painted separate marks for different operating depths. The field no longer had one water level. It had several working conditions, each tied to what the land was showing them. By the time the trap records began to level out, Mace offered Aaron his largest order yet. The market price was strong, and the payment would cover most of the season's pumping costs, along with the rent still owed to Ruth. For the first time, the numbers on June's spreadsheet looked capable of carrying the field instead of merely defending it. Then the forecast turned warm. Before daylight, the oxygen readings began slipping in several sections. The traps were still producing, but the water behind them was moving in the wrong direction. June plotted the readings beside the catch totals and saw the same warning appear across 3 mornings. Aaron could have added traps and harvested hard for a few days. The order was within reach if the water held long enough. At the kitchen table, June placed Mace's purchase order beside the oxygen chart. She did not tell her father which one to choose. Aaron read the order twice. His eyes stayed on the total at the bottom longer than they stayed on the graph. The next morning, he removed traps from the most vulnerable sections while they were still catching crawfish. Then he called Mace and cut most of the shipment. "I can buy crawfish," Mace said. "I can't buy your reason for not having them." "Then I'll call when the field can afford to sell them." Aaron lowered selected sections and used the cut-throughs to move fresher water along each route. He adjusted the gate in stages, watching the flow instead of forcing the entire field to one depth. The forecast brought heat, but no rescuing rain. Back at the table, June deleted the expected revenue from that week's column. The column marked next season remained in place. Once the oxygen readings steadied, Aaron and June began a 10-day test across the entire field. They kept the trap effort consistent and recorded each section separately. Trap count, total weight, marketable size, and the hours between setting and pulling. The goal was not one impressive morning. They wanted to know whether the field could keep producing beyond the easy water near the inlet. Sections that had once stayed blank began adding modest, dependable catches. Some yielded less than others. A few produced later in the cycle. By the 9th day, every section had a recorded harvest except 42. Aaron reached that corner before sunrise on the final morning. The water there was shallower than it was near the center, but the narrow channel now carried a steady current through the forage instead of around it. The first trap felt light. The second held several small crawfish that June returned to the water. In the third, enough market-sized crawfish moved against the wire to give section 42 its first measurable entry. June weighed them, wrote the number, and shaded the final space on the map. Ruth was checking the drainage gate at the other end of the field. Mace arrived later, after the day's catch had been combined from several routes. He reviewed the records before asking how much Aaron could maintain over the next 3 weeks. The colored sections were uneven, but none remained empty. Aaron studied the last number June had entered. What did that acre need that I wasn't giving it? When the crawfish season ended, Aaron opened the drainage gate on the date June had circled months earlier. Water left the field along the routes they had corrected together. It did not collect behind the rebuilt levees, or remain trapped in the sections that had once gone still. The traps came out first, then the red stakes. Within days, Ruth could walk across enough dry ground for a small utility vehicle to follow. She brought Aaron a new lease. The base rent was lower, with a share of the season's revenue added in its place. The agreement also set clear dates for flooding, crawfish harvest, drainage, and preparation for the next rice crop. Mace called about the following season. How much can you commit? Aaron looked toward June, who was finishing the production figures for each numbered acre. I'll give you a number when the field does. A rice planter entered the Bell property a few weeks later, crossing ground where crawfish traps had stood in shallow water. June kept one red stake beside the drainage gate. She painted 2 marks on it, the operating level for crawfish and the level the water had to fall below before planting. Aaron never proved the field could stay dry. He proved it did not have to be the same kind of land all year.